Anyway, this is the January meeting of our Living into Inclusivity conversation group. My name is John Coleman Campbell. I'm the lead pastor of First United Methodist Church in Wenatchee, Washington. And I think the first thing we do is introduce ourselves. So Rufus?
Hi, Rufus Woods, columnist for Wenatchee World and a lifelong resident of this community, and love this place.
David?
I'm Pastor Dave Haven from Celebration Lutheran Church in East Wenatchee, and glad to be part of this conversation.
And Karen?
I'm Karen Rutherford, a community member, board member of the getting ready to open new Pinnacles Prep Charter School, and a 30-year resident of the Valley.
Francis?
I'm Frances Twiggs. I am the rector of St. Luke's Episcopal Church here in Wenatchee, Washington, and I've been here about 5.5 years now.
Sheila?
I'm Sheila Marie, Associate Pastor at First United Methodist Church in Wenatchee, and have lived here 18 months so far.
Laura?
I'm Laura Shinham. I'm the pastor at Cascade Unitarian Universalist Fellowship in East Wenatchee and have been in the Valley since 2012, so 8.5 years about.
And James?
I'm James Allgard, and I'm pastor at Grace Lutheran Church in Wenatchee, and I've been in the area for about 7.5 years.
Okay, thank you. Our conversation, which has been going on for several months now, has been guided by the Racial Healing Handbook by Dr. Annalise Singh, who is a professor of diversity, equity, and inclusion at the University of Georgia. And this month we are taking on chapter 5, I believe, Raise Your Race Consciousness. Dr. Singh suggests a couple of ways that we can do that to raise our consciousness. Education and reading books, watching movies, attending workshops and conferences, listening to podcasts and music, for example, may be ways of educating ourselves. And the other way of raising our consciousness, she says, is through people, getting to know people, making acquaintances, if not friends. And she suggests, especially with activists and community leaders, politicians, educators, religious, spiritual leaders, authors, and the like. She says to note the ways that we have raised our race consciousness in the past and how we might do so going forward. And I'm going to invite our group to share their memories and thoughts on that in a moment. But I thought maybe I'd answer the question for myself first. The education piece, movies I thought about, probably the most profound one in my life anyway, it would be To Kill a Mockingbird, which of course isn't a historical movie, but nonetheless it raised those issues of racism for me as a younger teenager. I think is probably when I saw that, probably even read the book, I think, in high school. But I think the movie was, for me, more powerful. Other kinds of movies, Cry Freedom, 42 about Jackie Robinson, books, including Cry the Beloved Country from South Africa, Looking Like the Enemy, a book by, what's her name, escaping me right now anyway, about Japanese American woman who was interned during the war and going about her experience in the going to the camps. Several books by Desmond Tutu, Massacre at Sand Creek, about massacre of Native Americans in Colorado in the 19th century. And there, Rufus, you may help me remember this one because I picked it up at the Wenatchee World quite a while back, but had something to do with the history of the racism in this area.
Yes, all of a sudden drawing a blank on it. I've got a copy right here, but I can't remember off the top of my head.
And
History of,
my copy has to be in the house somewhere, but I can't find it. So,
Wenatchee's Dark Past.
thank you.
okay, yeah, thank you. And since we last met, I have read this. I'm Black, I'm Christian, I'm a Methodist. And about 10 or 11 chapters, whatever, each written by a different African-American Methodist person, and talking about how they're sticking with the church, at least for the moment, in spite of our not always admirable history, things that they value in the church and the theology and such. So those are some of the, and educationally, our United Methodist Conference anyway requires us pastors to take every 4 years something we call cultural competency workshops to become more aware of other cultures and peoples and things, and be able to relate and not make fools of ourselves and whatever. But those are some of the educational things I've thought of. I think probably more profoundly for me, though, my influences in my life have been relationships with the Basutu people in Southern Africa, where I served in Peace Corps many years ago now, but returned 2 or 3 times since. And that's a country that's entirely surrounded by the Republic of South Africa. And when I was working there, it was in the days of apartheid, and certainly got to know racism in a new and different way up until then in my life anyway. Also have served a congregation that was historically Japanese American for 7 years in Spokane. And these, well, some of these people I think I could describe as leaders and activists, but most of them are just, I think, regular folk, and come to appreciate the stresses, pressures, whatever in their lives, as well as their cultures and then their ways of being and doing, so that when there is something happens, it becomes more personal. It affects my friends, people that I love, people I respect. It's not just some undefined other people. Some other folks, my son's father-in-law is from India, so that married to an Anglo-American, but so my son's wife is, I guess, half Indian, but appreciated getting to know him, his family, when, especially around their wedding, when the whole family comes in and all the different traditions, and just a wonderful several-day event. It wasn't just 1 hour on a whatever Saturday. It was a wonderful thing. And I've also over the years known a couple of different Native American storytellers, and those kind of relationships. So anyway, how shall we go here? James, have you thought about this? What kind of influences, what ways have you raised your race consciousness?
Thanks, John. If I could just say to you, when you are able to speak about personal relationships that you have had and that you, I think, continue to maintain, that's really inspiring, I think is the right word for me. I appreciate hearing that from you. I seem to have really picked up on this as a real effort to want to dig deeper and look for ways to change my assumptions about myself and about the world around me. And so I've been dipping into a lot of different kinds of readings, but music is also important to me. So um, there are some musicians, especially from the 60s, 50s and 60s and 70s, who have really begun to speak volumes to me as I listen to their work. And there's this one song in particular that just, it's like, how should I say it? It's an uncomfortable song to listen to, and yet I know that I need to. And it's an old jazz, um, um, kind of just a grief-stricken ballad called "Strange Fruit," and it was written for Billie Holiday, whose own life story is one of tragedy anyway. But oh man, that song "Strange Fruit." An anti-lynching song, really, is what it is. It just puts it all out there, all of the senses that um, are part of the human experience and the ugliness of it. Um, and to know that I participate in a history, in a culture that has allowed for that to be a reality for fellow citizens. It's very sobering. Nina Simone, most of what she sings is just, there's this sense of, um, I guess, rage and longing all at the same time as she sings her stuff. And even so the song, the old campfire song, Kumbaya, I think that song in particular for me is one that holds so much contrast, because we even tease one another, oh, are we going to have a kumbaya moment now, right? As if that's kind of this warm and fuzzy, all fluff, everybody loving on one another. But that song, Kumbaya, one of the verses is, someone's dying, Lord, Kumbaya, right? Someone's praying, Lord, Kumbaya. In other words, we are being undone by people who share our same community, and we need you to come close, Lord. So that innocent little song, once you start to just at least become a little bit more open to the possibility of seeing it from another angle, it just, I feel like I just become a puddle through that experience. I like to go onto YouTube and watch videos, pieces of videos, portions of videos, long and short. James Baldwin has been a favorite of mine recently. He's very deep and complex thinker, but when he is sharing his experience and trying to get his points across to all of his audiences, including especially liberal white elite folks, it's really important for me to keep on listening to what he has to say. Several books recently, How to Be an Anti-Racist, My Grandmother's Hands, which I've mentioned before. And then also I've taken, just for the first time so far in my adulthood, the cultural competency assessment. And at the end of that, you get a chance to review it with a facilitator. And so my perceived competency as compared to the real competency, there's this super wide gap. And I think I'm doing so much better than the assessment really shows, right? And so I know that I'm on quite a journey myself. And then finally, in terms of personal relationships, I'll just say straight out that I appreciate this group, because we're committing to these to quite a long series of deeper conversations, reflecting about our own selves. So this counts for me, it really does. And then also I have known some folks who are not of the same ethnic or racial identity as myself. I've known some people for a long time, even from college. And so I've begun to reach out to them to see if we can maybe have some one-on-one conversation and maybe compare notes, even way back in college days, and say, you know, how did you experience life? How did I experience life? In one case, it's a gal who was an immigrant from India, and so she shared her immigration story. I shared my grandparents' immigration story. And so pretty soon we were able to find common themes and common sets of, you know, longings and what is meaningful for both of us. And I feel like that's just a really, for me at least, a really wonderful way to bridge gaps, gaps in understanding. So, yeah, I think that's about all I have to share at this point. Yeah. Should I invite the next person, John, or how about you? Okay. So Sheila, how about you?
Thanks, James. Just listening to some of the things that you and John have offered, I hadn't really thought about this, but I'm a story person and can really take things in when it's presented in story form, sometimes more so than facts and figures, and was thinking about books and other things, other exposures I've had. Roots by Alex Haley came to mind. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee came to mind, and I read that when I was really fairly young. I was exposed to poetry by Langston Hughes in high school through the youth pastor and his wife that we had at the time. So it's just interesting to me as I just don't think about it, and these things arise. Words from Desmond Tutu and the opportunity to see him live in the Tacoma Dome. Those are memorable places for me where it feels like a touch that's gone beyond everyday stuff, that you climb up a notch in how you think about things and what impacts you. In terms of music, I have always been attracted to spirituals and the blues, and to a certain extent jazz, and know that much of that comes from a multitude of places. I think about relationships. When I went to Drake University from 72 to 76, more than a third of the campus population was Black or other, and for me, coming from an entirely white monoculture until then, I don't know that it was eye-opening, but it certainly began to change my perspective and allowed me to interact in ways that simply hadn't been present before. In my first profession as a pharmacist, I worked in a community hospital in the Chicago suburbs. And when I think about the staff there, a bit of a United Nations exposure from a variety of cultures and backgrounds, and it was a natural part of the work I did. And so I wonder sometimes if I take for granted that exposure. And I look back now in gratitude for that exposure, and just what felt at the time like a very natural process of getting to know people and working with them, and as we worked to help others. So there's that. My son's family on his dad's side has interracial marriages, so we had natural contact there. And in course of study classes, which was my version of seminary as a local pastor, again, a United Nations complement. And that exposure has just been in the last half dozen years or so. So I'm really grateful for those things. I didn't enter into any of those things in the context of what can I do to be anti-racist. And so, but again, as I reflect on that, I'm incredibly grateful for the space and the grace and the opportunity to know people in a very natural way. I also happen to have a very close group of friends, and when I think about them, whether intentional or not, 75% of them would be considered other in the context of this conversation. So again, feel very blessed by that. Don't want to script anything in particular, except to say that when I think about it, there's far more exposure than I might have realized. And I find myself reflecting on where that's brought me today and how I listen and hear now. Karen?
Okay, there we go. I'm unmuted. Well, yes, I agree with you, Sheila. This has been fun for me to see the wide variety of experiences that lead us to other cultures. Music, and I'm such a visual person, so movies and also the written words. So music is something that I need to explore more. I was fascinated to write this out and to look at it. Currently, in terms of what I'm reading right now or doing right now, there have been some intriguing podcasts. I've joined the podcast world, and two of them have held my attention. One of them is Nice White Parents podcast, and it's very difficult for me to listen to, but very good for me to listen to. I appreciate it, so well done. And the other one is the 1619 Project. I had read a lot on it and read the curriculum, so it was great for me to be able to participate in the podcast, which is excellent. And films, oh my goodness, I think all through the lockdown quarantine of COVID, I have become a film, one with Netflix and Amazon, and I'm sorry, my dog is barking in the back. I mean, I think of the wide variety that there is out there, that is such as James Baldwin has been mentioned. I Am Not Your Negro was absolutely mesmerizing for me to watch. It was very good. Just an introduction to James Baldwin, who I knew just briefly, was familiar with his work, to be able to get more detailed. What an amazing individual, amazing life. All the way to a real contemporary type movie that it really touched me was Hidden Figures, the movie about NASA and the Black women, and that one was, I thought, really accessible and pertinent. In terms of books to read, again, I've done a lot of reading, and I think I'm a children's literature aficionado. So I read a lot of James Reynolds books in terms of his young adult books, which are absolutely excellent, to see the world through the eyes of Black teenagers. They were quite moving. And also the other two that really stood out to me are Caste, basically the history of the caste system in the United States. It's quite good. And her other book, Warmth of the Other Suns, which is basically the migration from the South to basically the Detroit, Chicago area for the Black population. That was excellent for me. But there's one author in particular that I feel like I've really want to keep in touch with, and that's Ibram Kendi. His podcast I listen to, and I also follow him on Facebook and Twitter. And I have really appreciated his take on the last year, especially current events. His Twitter feed from last Wednesday with the storming of the Capitol was absolutely mesmerizing to me, to have that perspective, that view live from a Black individual about their feelings on that event. It brought me literally to tears. So he's a very contemporary, right now I'm listening to it. Two of the other things that have been memorable to me in the past couple of years, I love, Sheila, how you talked about the things that you went to and you did that were outside of the realm of you did them naturally, not seeking out to have an enhanced conscience. Sometimes those are the most powerful. I happened to wander into I literally wandered into the National Museum of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, probably, I want to say 2 years ago now. It's hard to believe. Time is relative nowadays. And they had an opening. You normally you had to, it was right after it opened, and you needed to have your special ticket. And they had an opening. They let me go in, and I had no idea what it was going to be about. And literally 4 hours later, I was still there, reading every bit. I was so absolutely mesmerized. I was so enthralled with what was there, and the deep culture of our African American population, and also the amazing history. Again, moved me to tears, moved me to absolute fascination. You think you know it, and you didn't. I plan to go back. I recommend it to everyone to visit it in DC, Smithsonian. And then the other one that I'll end with is again, it's kind of a live feed type thing. I went to a small liberal arts college, Whitman College in Walla Walla. We didn't have many people of color. We really didn't. And I have, over the past probably 2 or 3 years, reconnected. A whole group of us have reconnected. And one gentleman was in our circle of friends, and a Black man now lives in Seattle. And it has been wonderful, again, in real time, to get his views on, especially the past 4 years, of what is going on. Someone I knew, but I had never, again, what has been brought up, never asked him about what it was like to grow up, never asked him what his feelings were. He was just kind of a member of our crowd. And now to kind of peel back the layers of his experience. And so that's been really good for me personally, because we share that 4 years of college bonding spirit, so to speak, to go beyond that. So that has been really good. So a lot of in depth. With COVID, I think we've been able to do that, and it's been fun to reach back and hope, to look what we can carry into the future. So on that note, I will pass it off to Laura.
Thank you, Karen. It's been fun to kind of reflect on all these things and the vastness of it for me. I affirm everything that everybody said and have touched on all those as well. The films that I've seen in the past couple years that have stood out the most in this area are Us, Get Out, and Selma. Selma, of course, is the story of what happened in Selma. But it was good to see that and understand it. And but Us and Get Out are 2 films that are, because my youngest is very into thrillers and horror movies, they're in that realm, but they add a twist to them, add a real twist to them that is very has a big commentary on our society and racism, and it really packs a punch at the end. And so they went beyond, and they were both directed by a Black director, which my mind will not bring up at the moment. But they pack a punch at the end, and make you think about what's going on. And those are the movies that I like to get into and think about. I'm really a book person. I am a huge book person. And beyond nonfiction, one of the things that I was able to do, there's a organization or a group that's called Homebrewed Christianity. And they've been able to offer some courses online and stuff. And one of them was with James Cone and his idea of Black theology. And so being able to dig into that and see how that reframes some of the scripture thing, some of the theology, some of the ideas behind it, and all of those has been really enlightening. Some other nonfiction, Sonia Renee Taylor wrote a book, My Body is Not an Apology. And it really is, it's a revolutionary concept on self-compassion, with the underlying idea that self-compassion leads to revolutionary compassion for others. And so that's her premise. And it's a different concept than what we usually think about when we think about self-compassion. It's a wider concept. It's a deeper understanding of who we are and our the divinity that we bring into the world by being just born, and the specialness of that. So it's really wonderful. And Brian Stevenson, in his book as well as film, which we were able to host, well, it was available free in January through different platforms, and the church watched all that. And then several groups came out of that, discussion groups. Well, last January, not this January. It's been a year. So those are some of the, as well as CAST, which is fantastic. Adrienne Murray Brown with her emergent strategy and rethinking leadership and how to change leadership and not just have a white patriarchal kind of structure to it has been really good. And but then the other thing that I've done is I've made an effort to go in and read authors from different backgrounds that are fiction, because that's really where I can expand my own understanding of things. And one book, Homegoing, is a great book that takes two families that were started in Africa in tribes and follows them all the way up through the civil rights and all the generations and what happened with them. And they both took different paths. And it was just really enlightening to have kind of like that story, what you're talking about, Sheila, of, you know, really getting into the story instead of just the facts and stuff. And several other kinds of authors and places. They're There by Tommy Orange. We just read that as one of our groups at the church, which was really, took a different take. It was about urban Native American and set in Oakland, California, where I lived quite a bit of time, and opened up a new perspective to that area and that understanding of people. Where I struggle, I can dive into a book, I can dive into a movie, all of those things. Where I struggle is relationships. And I have lots of clergy colleagues in the Unitarian Universalist faith that I can turn to and look to for wisdom and accountability. So that's where a lot of that comes from. I grew up in predominantly white areas, so there wasn't an opportunity to to make those connections throughout my life. But with that said, my undergraduate's in anthropology and sociology, and a lot of the work that I did was going in and talking to communities of minorities or different ethnic groups. So learned a lot through there. So that's kind of where I'm at. I really am into books, really into fiction and different authors there, and then also sprinkle in nonfiction and classes and other stuff. So Francis, how about you?
Thank you. Yeah, listen to everybody. It's made me kind of like, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. So thank you for that reminder, and just hearing all the different avenues that I can also explore and think about the places I've been, and looking back at my time and exposure and experience. Books and movies, I think, are what really come to mind. Early on as a kid, reading an autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr., probably I was around 10 or so. And the big movies then that were coming out, In the Heat of the Night, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, To Sir with Love, all those, To Kill a Mockingbird. That was college when I finally was up past midnight watching the watching the late movies, and reading lots of things about Native Americans, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, autobiographies of different Native American leaders, the stories of the Nez Perce, the stories of the Apache, the stories of Tecumseh. That's a lot of the educational reading about, I think I've mentioned before, reading about our own history of how we orchestrated the genocide, and writing a paper in college on that. So getting that kind of experience, reading books of, I've read Toni Morrison, Beloved, and then I was introduced a number of years ago, because I love science fiction. I read science fiction all the time when I was a teenager in college, and so Octavia Butler, and reading her science fiction books were just amazing. And another one that was given to me by a sister of mine, Woman on the Edge of Time, which is a wonderful book about just the, what happens to women, and women who are in an othered category. This is a Latina woman, and how their concerns can be exploded into, oh, they're mentally ill. And it was just a wonderful book to read. And because it was also got into gender identity. So it really explored many of the categories that we often get stuck in our bubbles about. So I highly recommend that book, Woman on the Edge of Time. If you can kind of get into science fiction. Some contemporary movies that kind of deal with issues but have comedy in them. Smoke Signals, which are current day Native Americans, and another one that I saw that is really, I don't know if you can get it or not, but it's called A Day Without a Mexican. That's also has a lot of exploration into our relationship with, and has built-in comedy around it, so that kind of interspersed with information, giving information about, Mexican people and our assumptions, and other Latino people. So that's kind of educationally. I've also recently just finished the work with Standing on Sacred Ground with the Episcopal Church, which is a 10-week session on learning about our white history, And it's an excellent series that is open to anybody. Once you have to have an Episcopalian in the group, but then you can have a group made up of different folks. But the Episcopal Church has the rights to the film clips that they use in the series. So that was a great opportunity to work with folks in that. And this group, I think it was James, yeah, this group I think it's important. The books I've been reading, they talk about how, we white people need to continue our own learning with each other. So I think it is important that we continue to do this. One other book that I just recently picked up that I'm going to be starting to read is White Too Long. The story of white supremacy and Christianity. That's Robert P. Jones, who's written that. Yeah, because talking about the legacy of how evangelical white Christians, of which he is part, he says is just right there with philosophy of white supremacy. So, and I think the same when I think about my relationships and the bubble I grew up in Tennessee, Upper East Tennessee, in a suburb that resisted being taken in by the city so they could have white schools. My experience, it wasn't until college, until I started to have relationships with people of different backgrounds and different colors. I had my sisters in college who would be talking about their experiences because they left long before I did to go to college, and so I had that back and forth when they would come home and talk about what was going on. And of course, what was going on for them was, they were hippies, so there was all kinds of things. The Vietnam War, watching some friends going off to Canada while other friends going to Vietnam. So all of that and getting that exposure through them. So which helped me, I think, then when I went into the world on my own, which was not very far. It was like, an hour away that I could drive back and forth to college if I didn't want to stay in the dorm. But, it started. And then the Air Force, going into the Air Force and then really being amongst different folks, but realizing that, these were all, except for my college where I think I had good friends from different backgrounds, but then, we leave these friends behind. And the Air Force, they were folks that I would associate with at work. But then I went home and associated with white people. And leaving the Air Force, moving to a larger city in Ohio and working for the government, and again, work associations with people of color and different backgrounds, but then going back home to church and being with white people, and just kind of that realization that it's very limited in that sense. My relationships are limited. Going to a mission only for a week, as opposed to, John, your very in-depth exposure, a mission work at a Navajo reservation, or mission work at Pine Ridge when I went to the Lakota. Wonderful experiences. It was wonderful to be a part of that. and having the opportunity at some point in my life in Knoxville, Tennessee, they decided they wanted to have their very first powwow. And so being able to be a part of that committee to put that together and work with Native peoples and learn just, in a way that I hadn't through my books, a culture, people with their culture, and learning when they would talk, as we were saying, well, we'll start it when we start it because we're all on Indian time, and that was the first time I'd ever heard that, expression through that committee of people. So limited interaction, I think very valuable interaction. And so how can I stretch myself now? How do we, I just pray that it's just, I'm open to being able to reach out and to see what happens. We can't say, okay, I'm going to make a friend today. And I realize also in my position where I am working, it's also a bubble. I've been here, 5.5 years. I tend to just kind of navigate in the world of church, and those are the folks I know. And so getting out of that bubble is another piece for me. But I think we're all on a journey that has the opportunity to expand our understanding.
Hey, Francis. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
You were just reminding me, maybe indirectly, about when it comes to relationships. One thing that I've had to really come to the point of realizing is I don't get to necessarily be the person who says that things are getting better now. That part of the vulnerability is actually giving that over to those who are really feeling the pains of discrimination, for example. It's really up to them to let me and the rest of us know, right? And so this need to control and manage is also, I think, part of it. And it can play out so well in relationships because, the closer we are to those who are different than us, the more willing we are to just give that over, And I think that's really hard. That part is really difficult. It feels more like a free fall than it does anything else.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah, so that's kind of where I am with these questions, which were very probing and deepening. And so the book it's been a good experience. I will invite Dave.
Thank you, Francis. I think I'll reverse the order in terms of we've had, numerous books and movies and all sorts of things named, and I can't keep track of them all. But the question that I want to start out with has to do with the title of our chapter. The title of our chapter is Raise Your Race Consciousness. And I started thinking about the question, who am I? Who am I? And where did I come from? And those kind of questions started prompting, what was I like when I grew up? What was I like in college and beyond, and seminary and in life when I became, a parent? Who am I? And what are those things that I think consciously of who am I, versus those things that either are suppressed or other people think of who I am, if you understand that. But behind that question came during this last week, especially last week during the insurrection, there were so many people that started talking about this is not who we are as a nation. That was kind of the standard line amongst a lot of people. And that prompted me to think about who am I? Is this who I am as a person? And, you know, we can debate whether or not insurrections and racism and all of that is who we are as a nation. But we need to look deeper into ourselves. And so that whole idea of education, that gets back to, you know, what are some things that have raised my race consciousness? And it has been lifelong. I think, Francis, you mentioned the Tecumseh, and I remember reading that book in high school about Tecumseh, and just my eyes being opened there. I remember, you know, throughout the years reading books by Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the experience that he had during World War II. Recently, the book by Michelle Obama, Becoming. I mean, it's an amazing book of her journey, and very insightful in terms of, in all of these people, in terms of who they were from the time they were born up until they died. So reading, many of you have already mentioned, like Ibram Kendi, and even locally, we have a Building Bridges workshop that's being sponsored by, led by Alex Schmidt up in Leavenworth. And some of you have heard the story of Father Osmar Aguirre at St. Joe's Catholic Church and his journey from El Salvador, and the incredible journey that he made to escape violence. So there are people that we can read about. There's people locally that we can tap into in terms of who they were, what their journey was, and how we can learn about racism in their particular cultures and events in their lives. Part of the ELCA Lutherans, we once a month our synod is sponsoring a sermon from people of color, and the program is called Being Color Amazed. So often people talk about being colorblind, and this is the opposite of that, is that being color amazed, and we think of nature and we look outside and we see all the diversity of nature and the colors, and so I think even in books and reflection and getting outdoors can help us understand the amazing world, that we are not just one color. So that's influenced me of who I am. But there are times when I'm blinded to that too, especially if I'm, as you mentioned, Francis, just in my own little church bubble and dealing with all the things that have to do with congregational life. But some of the things that have expanded that of who I am have to do with some of the local events and organizations that have helped me through that. And one of them is being able to be a part of the citizenship classes, the naturalization classes that are being offered in the community, and being able to tutor, and just amazing times to talk with folks from different cultures and different countries as they come to be, you know, wanting to be United States citizens, and hearing their stories and getting to know them on a personal level. It expands that question of who am I, because it helps me become a more well-rounded person. And with that, just the idea of being curious, asking questions about their cultures, and having some commonality, whether it's you know, how, you know, what's the name of the place where you grew up, and start from there. What's, you know, just trying to find parts of commonality with that. our the ELCA has every 3 years a youth gathering somewhere, and the last one was in Houston in 2018, and we took a tour, our group, of the Holocaust Museum in Houston, Texas, which everybody's going, what? There's a Holocaust Museum in Houston, Texas? Well, there is, and we got a chance to listen to a survivor of the Holocaust and hear his stories. And it was one of those poignant times for our youth group. And so for me, the education portion of this is not to just keep it within. I had an aunt once who read thousands of books, and after she died, we had the task of going through these books and wondering if we should keep them or toss them. And we couldn't believe how many books she had. But the thing that was amazing to us is that she didn't always share her knowledge and share with the rest of us some of that knowledge. And so I think just reading and observing has to be shared. And that's part of that being vulnerable as well, especially if we're talking with people that may not share our viewpoint. In our congregation, the last couple of years, we've had something called table talks, where we've tried to lift up some social issues. And it's kind of interesting because the people who may assume that it's going to be talking more in a progressive bent don't come to those tables to talk, which is sort of disappointing, because what I would prefer would be to have everybody come to the table so we can have conversation. So I don't know, I've got a train of thought here, but some of the books, I guess, is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi, the new one out by Barack Obama, A Promised Land. And then I mentioned another one called I'm Still Here by Austin Channing Brown. And the great courses, the Learning Company has some excellent courses on the history of slavery, for instance. So those are some good resources that way. Anyway, so back to the question, who am I? I think I need to keep revisiting that question daily and ask, who am I? But then the next question might be, whose am I? And of course, coming from a faith background, I think that's an important question as well. Whose am I? And then going on to that question or that statement, who are we as a people? Who are we as a nation? Can we admit, can we confess that we are not perfect? Can we admit and confess that we have a long ways to go and not dig our heels in and say, well, we're perfect. So there we go. Rufus.
Remind me never to go last again. No, it's been fun to listen to this discussion. What I love about this group is, there's so much, that ideas that each of us share spark into other ideas, other things to, I need to understand this, or, oh yeah, I remember that. And I was thinking about that as we've been having this discussion. And one of the things that I try to do is as much as possible, kind of develop a more holistic view of life. And so a lot of the readings I've done and the films I've watched and the thinking I've done has been trying to, how do I think about not just understanding that, but how do I translate that in a way that people might be able to at least even consider, right, and think about. One of the books that I've read recently, it's not on this topic specifically, but it's very much related. It's called, and some of you may have read it, it's called Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me. And it describes how we get locked into our views, how we get focused on, once we've made a decision that I support this person, or I'm for this thing, or I'm against the other thing, we find even with a mountain of evidence, we find ways not to just hold to our position. We can't stand the tension. We have to justify it, and we will tie ourselves into knots doing so. And it just breaking those habits and finding ways, and we all do it, right? This is all of us. It's not just people who disagree with me. It's me. I mean, I know a lot of things where I probably have a PhD in justification, but I think that's if I've been listening to this, the readings I've been doing the last couple of years specifically has been to try to understand my own thinking process. And so many of the books that you've mentioned and resources, movies and such. One of the books that I really enjoyed because it gave me a different perspective was Vincent Harding's The Inconvenient Hero. A story of Martin Luther King is told by one of his key lieutenants, and how misunderstood, how we've sanitized what he was and who he was and what he stood for. And we miss his anti-war protests. We miss the way in which he was a critic of our economic system, or so many of us do, maybe not all of us, but certainly society. We've kind of sanitized his into I have a dream speech, and that's it. And that we miss that there was more to it. And I think that whole kind of holistic view of, for me, is how do I pierce beyond the sort of easy categorization and into where's the truth there, and where do I, where am I in that whole piece. I also read, I just finished I'm Still Here, Black, a Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. And wow, what a Dave, you mentioned her, that is such a powerful, and raw, and yet it's in the face, but it's not, it's just, it's things I needed to hear. I needed to have that experience. My college roommate, his partner of 30 plus years is Black, and it was interesting. My college roommate and I were talking, and he was saying the events of the last 6 months to a year, and he said even he didn't understand, the experience. Like his partner, he couldn't even talk to him for about some issues. It was so. He thought, and he thought he was pretty dialed into it, and it's back to a willingness to want to understand and want to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes. And empathy these days seems to be in short supply. I also recall that an interview I had privileged to do at the museum, where I interviewed Arnold Cleveland, Colville, who was recounting the stories of growing up at the Pascal Sherman School in the Okanagan, and having to pick a name out of the hat because he couldn't use his given name, and the beatings he endured, and what he went through, and to have him describe these what that experience was like, and just to sort of, because books can't really tell you what it feels like, but to hear someone describe what that's like is immensely powerful. And it was just such a gift to be able to sit there and facilitate that conversation and try to understand where he was coming from, and not a sense of bitterness at all, but a sort of here's what it was, and I was so appreciative of his efforts. I think during my I read some of the similar books, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. I don't think those things landed for me early in. I don't think I just wasn't ready to really what is this and how does this apply today? And I think that's where this group and my efforts and all of our efforts are, how do we, come face to face with it, and not shy away from the uncomfortableness of not just what's happening, but how do I feel about it, and expressing that, what we're experiencing. And I think of the other thing of the here locally, the efforts to try to reconnect to Native American history here, the Pisquosa, and there's a thing at the museum here soon. Randy Lewis and the work he's done, the work up in the Okanagan, Pateras. Arnie Marchand just sent me a note. He's got a new book out. That are inviting us to just acknowledge what was there, and that's not just something in the past and something that we can now, that's vanished. It's that lives on in the bodies and in the culture and in the economic challenges of so many and who've been left behind. And so I've really treasured the relationships. I remember going through diversity training, and I think a lot of that stuff was really not well done. I think it was well intended, but it failed at a lot of levels. And I think instead, the efforts to sort of come to grips with and then translate into action, and in terms of owning your own story, and being willing to share what you know and what you believe, and also listen and to be able to engage. And I think that's the biggest challenge for me is just finding more conscious ways of engaging. And I try to do my writing, but I've got a lot more work to do in terms of leaning into those discussions. I've just enjoyed the journey. I've spent a lot more time in the last couple of years just consuming books and trying to think about these things, and then try to figure out how can I bring this in a way that somebody might be willing to at least, where I'm not just preaching to the choir, but I'm inviting people to think about it, who might not otherwise. And I think that to me is the responsibility I feel is, and I just have, I'm challenging myself to do that as much and as consciously and as calmly as possible, because these are not easy issues when there's a sort of an easier sense of denial. Well, that's not me. I didn't do that. That was somebody else, and so I don't have to worry about that. And yet these events and the implications and the damage that was done over time has been extraordinary, and so not being willing to acknowledge that. And as someone said earlier, not perfect. We're not near perfect. In fact, coming to grips with our own vulnerabilities, our own fallibilities, our own, I think that's just part of becoming a human being and living in this life. And whether you're a person of faith or not, I think that's what seems to me we're called to, and to see the bigger picture. I mean, we have such a deconstructed view of life. Life is this or this or this, and yet there's so much more. It's the context is everything. So that's I'm gonna bounce it back to you, John. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you all for your stories, your memories, your resources. I hope that maybe we'll take something from what we've heard and go find out more, or those who watch this video. Thank you for your question, Dave. Who am I? It would be an interesting question to ask other people who know me. Who am I? And see how they answer, how close that is to what I think I am. I'm not sure I want to know that though too. Anyway,
John?
yes.
John, I wanted to add something. When you spoke that way, Dave, it made me think differently about what we were talking about, and I appreciate it. Because one of the things that has been the most raising my conscience the most was traveling. And I've intentionally made sure, you know, with my family, with my kids and stuff, we could have gone on the airplane, I don't know how many times, but we drove across this country, I don't know how many times and how many ways, just to make sure our kids and that we got exposed to different people and different and understood different parts of our country and understood what the history in that area was and stuff. And so that has probably been the biggest educational experience that I've had is traveling and exposing myself to different areas and experiencing that with my kids through my kids' eyes as well, because you know they have different insights than what I would have. And so I just would add that when you're talking about who am I and how my consciousness has been raised.
I think we've done a lot of traveling as well, and I'm one who likes to stop at historical markers along the road, which extends our travel time quite a bit.
Hope your kids love you as much as mine do when I do that.
Yeah. But what I think is interesting is that everybody that writes one of those historical markers writes it from a perspective. And so it's always good to take that wherever the historical marker is. Sometimes it's more a hysterical marker than a historical marker, but to go further and dig a little deeper and find the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. But at least it prompts something. It triggers the curiosity, and you can put a place with a name. And I think that's important. So yeah, thank you, Laura, for that.
Well, again, thank you all. But I'm looking at the time and also realizing that this is only half the chapter, what we've talked about here. The second half of the chapter deals with how you become an anti-racist. And I'm not sure if we want to tackle that now or looking, as I say, the time is, we're getting near 3 o'clock. Any sense on that?
I think we may want to tackle that and at another time, since we've gone about an hour and a half now.
Okay. We did have a question from Rufus about sharing resources on the chat. I think was positively, that would be a good thing.
I'm going to stop the
James.
recording so that way